The morning Cora Hart was told her homestead would be nothing but frozen dirt and dead dreams before spring arrived. She was standing ankle-deep in mud with a broken fence post in her hands and fire enough in her chest to burn down half of Kansas. It was October of 1874, and the prairie wind had begun to carry that particular bite that promised a hard winter was not merely coming, but already crouching at the edge of the horizon, waiting. The sky above the Hart property on the outskirts of Millhaven, Kansas, was the color of pewter, heavy and low, and the cottonwoods along the creek bed had gone skeletal overnight, their last yellow leaves torn away by a gust that swept in from the northwest without warning or mercy. Cora was 26 years old, and she had been alone on this land for 3 months. Her husband, Edmund Hart, had died of a fever in July, 6 weeks after they had filed the homestead claim under the Homestead Act of 1862, which promised 160 acres to anyone willing to work it for 5 years and make improvements. Edmund had been full of plans. He had talked about wheat and corn and a proper barn, and a smokehouse and children running between the rows come summer. He had talked about it every single night on the wagon ride west from Ohio, his voice soft and steady in the darkness of the canvas, and Cora had listened and believed every word of it because Edmund believed every word of it, and that had always been enough. Then he was gone, and the believing had fallen entirely to her. She had done what she could. She had patched the small cabin they had begun together, filling the gaps in the sod walls with more sod and stuffing rags into the places where the wind whistled through the window frames. She had tried to break more ground for planting, but the prairie sod was ancient and thick and stubborn, a mat of grass roots that went down so deep it was like trying to plow through braided rope. She had one horse, a brown mare named Hazel, and a single-blade plow that Edmund had bought second-hand in Millhaven, and she had broken 2 acres on her own, bleeding her palms and wearing through 2 pairs of gloves before the ground hardened. She had planted late and harvested little, a half bushel of potatoes, some dried beans, a small barrel of cornmeal purchased from a trader who passed through in September, and looked at her small patch of ground and her tired face, and said nothing charitable. And now it was October, and the fence along the north pasture had come down in the night, and Norbert Gaines, who owned the adjoining 2,000 acres and ran cattle across most of the county, had ridden over that morning with 2 of his ranch hands, and told her with the pleasantness of a man who knows he holds all the cards that she ought to think seriously about selling before winter made the whole business unbearable. "You won't last the season," he had said, sitting easy in his saddle, his silver watch chain catching what little light the morning offered. He was a wide-shouldered man of 50 with a thick mustache and the kind of patience that only comes from owning enough land that waiting costs you nothing. "I'll give you a fair price for the claim, $200. You could go back east, find something suitable for a woman on her own." Cora had looked at him for a long moment. She had looked at the land behind him, her land, flat and brown and enormous under that pewter sky. She had thought about Edmund and about his plans and about the way he had said her name in the dark of the wagon, soft as breathing. "I am not selling," she had said. Norbert Gaines had nodded as though she had said something amusing. "Come February, you'll think different," he said, and turned his horse and rode away, and his ranch hands followed without looking back at her, and that was when she had picked up the broken fence post and stood holding it in the mud, and felt the fire rise up in her chest so hot she could barely breathe around it. She was not leaving. She did not know exactly how she was staying, but she was not leaving. The town of Millhaven was 3 miles east along the creek road, and Cora walked it 2 days later with a list in her apron pocket and exactly $11.40 in her purse. The general store was run by a man named Fletcher Dobbs and his wife, Alma, who was one of the few people in Millhaven who had treated Cora with straightforward kindness since Edmund died. Alma had brought food twice in the weeks after the death, had sat with her, had not offered opinions about what a woman alone ought to do. Cora needed seed for spring planting, which meant she needed to plan for spring planting. She needed lumber for repairs to the barn lean-to that was beginning to lean so far in one direction it would not survive a hard snow. She needed nails and rope, and another 50 pounds of flour and salt pork enough to last the winter. What she had was $11.40. Fletcher Dobbs looked at her list and looked at his ledger and said he could extend her credit for the flour and the salt pork, given that she had paid promptly in the past, but the lumber and the seed she would need to purchase outright or arrange otherwise. Lumber was expensive. Good seed was expensive. He was not unsympathetic, he said, but he was also running a business. Alma Dobbs came around the counter and put her hand on Cora's arm. "There is a man staying at Hennessy's," she said quietly. "Arrived yesterday. He does carpentry work and odd jobs for folks. Not one of the Gaines riders, not connected to anyone around here. He seemed decent. You might speak to him." Cora thanked her and bought what she could afford and walked across the main street of Millhaven to the place that served as a combination boarding house and saloon. Hennessy's was a two-story building of weathered pine boards with a long porch across the front, and there were 3 horses tied at the rail, and Cora stopped at the door because she had never in her life walked into a saloon alone, and the thought gave her a moment of hesitation. She went in. The room smelled of tobacco and wood smoke and something fried. There were 4 tables, and 2 of them had men at them playing cards, and the bar along the left wall was tended by a young man she did not recognize. She looked around and was about to ask at the bar when a voice came from the corner, low and measured. "You look like a woman who needs something built." She turned. He was sitting alone at the corner table with a cup of coffee and a small notebook open in front of him. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and he was wearing a working man's clothes, canvas trousers and a heavy flannel shirt, with a coat draped over the back of his chair. His hat was on the table beside the notebook. His eyes, she noticed, were the particular light brown of creek water in summer, clear and attentive, and they were looking at her with something that was not intrusion but was definitely curiosity. He stood up. He was tall. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Walter Hawkins," he said. "Sit down if you like. The coffee here is not good, but it's hot." Cora sat. She set her purse on her lap and looked at him across the table. "My name is Cora Hart," she said. "I have a homestead 3 miles west. I need lumber work done and I cannot pay full price for it. I will pay what I can and the rest in labor come spring, in crops or in work." Walter Hawkins looked at her for a moment. He had a way of being still, she noticed, that was different from the stillness of lazy men. It was a working stillness, the kind of quiet that comes from paying careful attention. "What kind of lumber work?" he said. "A lean-to attached to my barn is going to collapse in the first significant snow. I need it reframed and re-roofed. I also need the north fence line repaired before my mare gets out and wanders onto Norbert Gaines' land." Something shifted slightly in his expression at the name Gaines. "You neighbor Gaines," he said, "on the north side." He picked up his coffee cup and set it down. "He give you trouble. He offered to buy my claim for $200 and told me I would not last the season," Cora said. "I told him I was not selling." Walter Hawkins looked at her for another of those attentive moments, and then something happened at the corner of his mouth that was almost a smile but not quite. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you have for materials and what the structure looks like." That was how it began. He rode out to the Hart homestead the following morning, arriving just as the light was coming up gray and pale over the flat land to the east. Cora was already outside, splitting wood, and she heard the horse before she saw it, a solid gray gelding with a calm walk that matched the man in the saddle. Walter Hawkins swung down and tied the horse to the post by the water trough and looked at the property with a carpenter's eye, moving his gaze from the cabin to the barn to the lean-to to the fence line without saying anything for a long moment. The cabin was low and built partly of sod, partly of timber, with a single window on the south side. The barn was small but reasonably solid, the work of Edmund's hands in those 6 weeks before the fever took him, and the lean-to attached to the barn's east side was visibly tilting, its roofline sagging in the middle, two of its corner posts rotted through at the base. Walter walked around the lean-to twice. He crouched and looked at the bases of the posts. He stood and put his hand against the wall and pushed gently, and the whole structure moved. "How much lumber do you have?" he said. 12 boards of various length in the barn. Edmund bought them before he died. I will need more. I can bring out what I need from Millhaven and settle the cost into the arrangement. Cora looked at him carefully. What arrangement? Half now of what you have and half come harvest next year. He paused. You plan to plant spring wheat. I plan to plant whatever will grow, she said, that almost smile again. Fair enough, he said. I will need to know the soil. He spent that first day doing things Cora had not expected. He repaired the lean-to supports well enough to make it safe through the winter, working steadily and with minimal waste of motion. And he also walked the 2 acres she had broken and crouched in the field and took a handful of soil and turned it between his fingers and smelled it. He walked the unbroken ground to the south, where the grass was still thick and winter brown, and he paced out distances that seemed to mean something to him, though he said nothing about it until midday when Cora brought out bread and cold salt pork, and they sat on the porch in the thin October sun. Your broken ground is good soil, he said, deep and dark. You have a low spot to the south that will catch snowmelt come March. If you break another 4 acres over winter when the ground permits, you could plant a real crop come spring, enough to make the claim pay. Cora looked at him. I cannot break 4 more acres alone, she said. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact, delivered without self-pity, and something about the directness of it made Walter Hawkins set down his bread and look at her with that attentive, still quality that she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he listened. No, he said, you cannot, but 2 people can. She looked at him for a long moment. You are offering to stay through the winter. I am offering to work through the winter, he said carefully. I have no other pressing obligation. I was heading to Colorado, but Colorado will be there come spring. Why, she said, and she was not asking about Colorado. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the flat land and the pale sky. Because you are not leaving, he said finally, and that seems worth helping. She considered this. She was a practical woman, and practicality told her that she needed the help, and that this man seemed capable and honest, and that Alma Dobbs had called him decent, which was a word Alma Dobbs did not use lightly. She was also a woman who had been alone for 3 months on 160 acres with a dead husband and a failing fence and a tilting lean-to, and something in the simple phrase that seems worth helping had struck her somewhere behind her breastbone with a force she was not prepared to examine yet. There is no extra room in the cabin, she said. You would need to sleep in the barn. I have slept in worse, he said. She nodded. Then we have an arrangement. The days that followed established a rhythm. Walter was up before Cora each morning, already at work by the time she came outside, and she learned quickly that he was not a man who required direction or management. He assessed what needed doing and did it with a quiet competence that was deeply reassuring in a way she had not expected. He finished the lean-to repairs in 2 days, then turned his attention to the fence line, replacing posts and stretching wire with the focused economy of someone who has done physical work long enough that it becomes almost meditative. Cora, for her part, did not stop her own work. She split wood and stacked it. She mended and patched and prepared. She drove Hazel into Millhaven for supplies and managed the small economy of the homestead with the careful precision of someone for whom every penny was load-bearing. She was not the kind of woman who stepped back when help arrived. She stepped sideways and kept moving. But she watched him. She watched him without being obvious about it, or she told herself she was not being obvious, though she suspected she was not as subtle as she imagined. She watched the way he worked, the deliberate care he took with every joint and every nail, the way he never wasted a board or a cut. She watched the way he was with Hazel, gentle and firm, earning the mare's trust in a single afternoon by simply being patient. She watched him in the evenings when he would sit on the barn step with his notebook and write things down, lists or drawings or something. She was not sure, and she found herself wondering what was in the notebook, the way you wonder about things you know are private, but that still pull at your curiosity. They ate supper together most evenings because it was practical and because the alternative was each of them eating alone in the dark, and Cora cooked simply and well, and Walter cleaned up afterward without being asked, and they talked. At first they talked about practical things, the state of the fence, the quality of the well water, the distance to Millhaven and the roads in different weather. But as October moved into November and the cold deepened and the evenings lengthened, the conversations grew around the edges, the way a fire grows when you add wood carefully. She learned that he was from Missouri, from a farming family in the river bottom country near Boonville. That he had come west at 20 after a disagreement with his father about the running of the farm, which he described only as a disagreement about what a man owes his own future. And Cora understood that there was more in that sentence than the words themselves carried. He had worked as a ranch hand, as a freighter, as a carpenter in 3 different territories, and he had acquired along the way a working knowledge of land and crops and timber and livestock that was practical and deep and earned. He had never married. He had come close once, he said, in Nebraska, a woman named Helen who had decided the uncertainty of his life was not what she wanted, and he said it without bitterness, which told Cora something about the man. He did not seem to carry resentments. He seemed to carry things the way the land carries winter, quietly and without complaint, waiting for the right season. She told him about Ohio, about her family, about meeting Edmund at a church social when she was 22 and falling in love with his plans and his gentleness. She told him about the wagon journey west, which had been beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, and about Edmund's death, which she described in plain terms because she had learned that the only way to carry grief was to carry it straight, without flinching from its weight. She had loved Edmund. That was true and whole, and she did not qualify it. Walter listened to all of it without rushing her or offering comfort she had not asked for, and she found that this, too, was something she valued deeply, the not rushing. The not filling the silence with words that were really just discomfort wearing a kind face. One evening in the middle of November, the first real snow came. It arrived in the early afternoon, a swift gray curtain moving across the prairie from the north, and Cora and Walter spent an hour getting Hazel secured and bringing in the last of the stacked wood that needed to be under cover, and they made it inside just as the snow began to fall in earnest, thick and fast and absolute. They sat at the small table in the cabin, the fire going strong in the iron stove, and Cora made coffee and set out bread and dried apple preserves, and the snow came down outside the single window until the world was entirely white and the cabin was an island of warmth and light in the middle of it. "Tell me about the notebook," she said. Walter looked up from his coffee. He raised one eyebrow slightly, which was, she was learning, his version of surprise. "The one you write in every evening," she said. "I am curious. You do not have to tell me if it is private." He was quiet for a moment, and then he went to his coat by the door and came back with the notebook and set it on the table between them. It was a small thing, soft-covered, filled with pencil writing and small, precise drawings. "Crop layouts," he said, "and notes on soil and water and timing. I have been mapping your land for a spring planting plan." She looked at the open pages. The drawings were careful and detailed, the south field divided into sections with notes alongside in a small, clear hand. Wheat here where the snowmelt would give early moisture. Corn further east where the ground was higher and would drain faster. A kitchen garden close to the cabin on the south wall to catch the warmth. A plan for breaking the additional ground in the windows between freezes when the frost would have already done some of the hard work of loosening the sod. She looked up at him. "You have been planning all of this," she said. "Since I walked the land that first day," he said. She looked back at the notebook, and she felt something in her chest shift, quiet and significant, the way a floorboard settles when weight is placed on it just right. He had been here 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks, he had been building her a future in that small notebook, while he repaired her fences and her linta with his hands. He had seen her land the way Edmund had seen it, as a thing of possibility, but with the added weight of someone who had actually worked enough land to know how to read it. "Walter," she said, and something about saying his name like that, without a request attached to it, made her stop and clear her throat. "Yes," he said, and his voice was quiet. "Thank you," she said, "for this." He looked at her across the table, and the snow was still coming down outside, and the fire was warm, and he said, "You would have figured it out yourself." "Maybe," she said, "but it is different having someone figure it out with you." Something moved across his face then, brief and complex, and he looked down at his coffee, and the evening continued. November deepened into December, and the prairie winter settled in with full authority. There were days when the temperature dropped so far that Cora's breath frosted on the inside of the window glass, and the water in the bucket by the door froze solid overnight. There were days when the wind came down from the north with such force that walking to the barn was a matter of leaning into it at a hard angle and moving slowly, and Walter strung a rope from the cabin door to the barn door so that neither of them would lose their way in a whiteout, which was a precaution that Cora had read about but not thought to implement, and which might have been unnecessary but also might have saved one or both of their lives. On the hard, cold days when outside work was impossible, Walter worked inside. He built shelves along the cabin wall for Cora's supplies, well-fitted and level and sturdy, and he repaired the chair whose leg had been wobbling since September, and he fashioned a proper boot bench for by the door so that muddy and snowy footwear did not track through the cabin. He did these things without being asked, simply seeing what needed doing and doing it, and Cora watched him work in the limited space of the cabin and felt the daily accumulation of his presence in her life the way you feel the warmth of a fire, something that starts as a practical comfort and becomes something you cannot quite imagine being without. They were careful with each other. She knew that, and she believed he knew it too. They were careful because the situation required a certain kind of care. A woman and a man wintering alone on a homestead miles from the nearest neighbor, and because they were both people of principle, and because what was growing between them was fragile and new, and neither of them was the kind of person who grabs at fragile things. There was the evening he cut his hand on a poorly set nail, a deep slice across the palm, and she cleaned it and wrapped it without thinking, working with quick efficiency, and she looked up from his bandaged hand and found him looking at her from a distance of about 8 inches with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something open and unguarded, and the moment stretched between them like a wire pulled tight, and then she stood up and said she would check on the fire, and she did. And nothing else was said. There was the afternoon, a rider from the Gaines ranch came to the property line and shouted across the fence that Mrs. Hart ought to think about what she was doing wintering with a man who was not her husband, a comment clearly intended to be delivered within hearing of both of them, and Cora walked to the fence line and looked at the rider with eyes so cold they could have frozen the creek, and said that Norbert Gaines could concern himself with the morality of his own household and leave her to manage hers, and the rider left. And when she turned back, Walter was standing by the barn door watching her with something that looked very much like admiration. There was Christmas, which was a thing they had not discussed, and which arrived on a Wednesday morning with a sharp blue sky and frost on the ground and the world entirely still. Cora made a proper breakfast with salt pork and fried cornmeal cakes and preserved peaches, and Walter came in from feeding Hazel and stopped in the door and looked at the table and then at her, and she said simply, "Merry Christmas, Walter," and he said, "Merry Christmas, Cora," and it was the first time he had used her given name without the formal address, and it fell on her like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. He had made her something. He brought it in wrapped in a piece of canvas, a small box of polished wood with a fitted lid, jointed at the corners so precisely that there was not a gap to be seen, smooth as a mirror. He had made it in the barn in the hours when she thought he was simply staying warm, working by the barn lantern after she had gone to bed. "For your seeds," he said, "to keep them dry through the winter." She held the box and ran her thumb along the smooth edge of the lid and pressed her lips together for a moment, and then she looked up at him. "I made you something too," she said. She had knitted him a pair of wool socks through the evenings of December, working by firelight after he had gone to the barn, because she had noticed that his boots let in more cold than they should and his feet must be suffering for it. He held the socks and looked at them and then looked at her with that open, unguarded expression again, and this time neither of them looked away for a long moment. "Cora," he said, and stopped. "Do not say it if you are not sure of it," she said quietly. "I am sure of it," he said. "I am not sure what to do with it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the prairie was bright and still and enormous, and the cabin was warm, and she thought about Edmund, and she thought about the future, and she thought about a man who had arrived with nothing she had asked for and given her everything she had needed, which was not quite the same thing but was, she was beginning to understand, possibly more important. "I am not sure either," she said, "but I am not afraid of it." He nodded slowly. He was still holding the socks. "I would like to stay," he said. "Past spring, I mean, past the arrangement." "What would staying look like?" she said. "It would look like whatever you want it to look like," he said. "I am not a man who pushes. But I am also not a man who wants to leave." She looked at him for a long time in the blue winter light coming through the south window, and then she said, "Let us get through winter first. Let us get the spring planting in, and then let us see." He nodded. "That is fair," he said. "Then sit down," she said, "and eat your breakfast." January was brutal. The hardest stretch came in the second week. A blizzard that lasted 3 days and dropped so much snow that, when it ended, the drifts were up to the cabin eaves on the north side, and the world was a flat, blinding white plain without feature or boundary. They were confined to the cabin for those 3 days, burning wood at a careful rate, melting snow for water, and the closeness of the small space was something that had to be navigated, which they did with a kind of thoughtful choreography that was, in its own way, more intimate than anything that had happened between them yet. They talked more in those 3 days than in all the weeks before combined. They talked about the things people talk about when there is nothing to do but talk, which is to say the real things, the things that sit at the back of ordinary days waiting for the extraordinary ones to bring them forward. Walter talked about what he had loved about farming as a boy before the disagreement with his father had soured it. The way a field looks in the evening light, the smell of cut wheat, the satisfaction of a straight furrow. He talked about it with a quiet longing that she recognized, because it was the same longing Edmund had carried for the land he had not yet had, except that Walter was talking about something he had once had and lost, which was a different kind of ache. She talked about what she had wanted before Edmund and the homestead, the things a girl from Ohio dreams before life offers its actual options. She had wanted to teach school, she said. She had read everything she could get her hands on and had a gift for explaining things, and in another life she might have been a school teacher in a small Ohio town, and she did not say it as a regret but simply as a fact of the life she had walked instead. "You could still teach," he said. "There is no school in Millhaven," she said. "There could be," he said. "Towns grow, schools get built." She looked at him. "You have a lot of faith in possibility for a man who has seen as much of the world as you have," she said. "I have seen enough of the world to know that the things worth having usually require someone to believe in them first," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is that what you are doing here, believing in something?" He met her eyes. "Yes," he said simply. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved the snow in long sifting curtains across the drifts. Cora Hart sat with her hands folded in her lap, and felt the thing in her chest that had been shifting and growing for weeks settle into something she could finally name, warm and certain and entirely new, different from what she had felt for Edmund, not in quality but in character. The way 2 true North Stars are different stars, even though they both point the same direction. She reached across the small table and covered his hands with hers for just a moment. His hands were warm and calloused and very still. Then she withdrew and picked up the book she had been reading, and he picked up his notebook, and they sat in the firelight while the blizzard howled outside, and neither of them said anything else. And everything was said. February arrived with a thaw that was not quite a thaw but a softening. A few days of temperatures above freezing that turned the world to mud and slush and gave everything the deceptive look of early spring. Walter used those days for the additional groundbreaking, going out with a team that he had arranged to borrow from a farmer named Driscoll who lived 5 miles south. A man with a steady pair of plow horses that could move through partially frozen ground in a way that Hazel alone could not. Cora worked alongside him, handling the second horse when the ground needed the plow run twice, managing the turns at the end of each furrow, her shoulders aching by noon and her back on fire by evening. And she did not complain once because she could see the dark earth turning up under the plow blade, rich and black as coffee, and every furrow was a furrow of spring. Norbert Gaines rode by one of those days. He stopped at the fence line and looked at what they were doing, and his expression shifted through something that might have been surprise before settling back into its customary pleasantness. "I see you got yourself some help," he said. "I did," Cora said, not stopping. "Be careful who you trust out here," Gaines said. "There are men who will work your land and walk off with the profit of it." Walter stopped the plow and looked at Gaines from across the field. He did not say anything. He simply looked, with that particular quality of stillness that he had, and Gaines held the look for a moment and then turned his horse and rode north along the fence line. That evening Cora asked Walter what he knew about Gaines. "I have heard things," he said carefully. "In town. He has pushed smaller homesteaders off their land before by various means. Running cattle through their crops, tying up their water rights, letting his cowhands discourage visitors. He prefers to do it without outright force if he can manage it." Cora felt the anger come back, steady and clean. "He will not push me off," she said. "No," Walter said, "I do not believe he will." He said it with a certainty that was not boastfulness but something sturdier and quieter, and Cora looked at him across the table and felt something that was not quite gratitude and not quite admiration but contained pieces of both, along with something warmer and less easily categorized. "Walter," she said. "Yes. When you said you wanted to stay past spring." She paused and looked at the table for a moment and then looked up at him. "I want to know what you meant by it exactly." He was quiet for a long moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Then he looked at her with those clear, creekwater eyes and said, "I meant that I have not thought about going to Colorado since about the second week of November. I meant that this land feels like it could be mine in a way that land has not felt to me since I was a boy. I meant that when I walk these fields with you, I feel like a man who is somewhere instead of a man who is between places." He paused. "And I meant that I have not been able to look at you without considerable effort for about 2 months." The considerable effort, said in his quiet, careful voice, made her laugh, a real laugh, sudden and warm, the first real laugh she had heard from herself in a long time, and the sound of it seemed to surprise both of them. "That is very honest," she said. "I am generally an honest man," he said. "I know," she said. "It is one of your better qualities." "I have others," he said, and this time the corner of his mouth did the thing it did, and it was not almost a smile but an actual one, real and unguarded, and it entirely changed his face and did something considerable to her composure. "I imagine you do," she said. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I am not ready to speak about the future yet, not in specific terms. Edmund has not been gone long enough for me to be ready for that. But I want you to know that what I said at Christmas about not being afraid, I meant that still." "That is enough," he said. "That is more than enough." March came, and with it the real thaw, and the world went from white to brown to the first tentative green along the creek bottom. The snowmelt ran south across the low field exactly as Walter's notebook had predicted, soaking into the broken ground and disappearing, leaving the soil dark and wet and ready. And Cora stood at the edge of the field one morning with her boots in the mud and the sun on her face for the first time in months, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight for a very long time. Walter drove to Millhaven and came back with seed. spring wheat and corn, and a small amount of oats. He had the seed in cloth bags in the back of the borrowed wagon, and he brought them into the barn and set them on the new shelves. And Cora stood in the barn doorway watching him and holding the wooden box he had made her at Christmas and thought, "This is what it looks like when someone stays." They planted in the first weeks of March, working from before light to after it, side by side in the soft field, Cora dropping seed from the bag at her hip while Walter worked the soil behind the plow. Her hands knew the work now, the measured pace, the even spacing, the way the ground receives seed if you give it properly. She had learned more about farming in the past 5 months than in the entire span of her marriage, not because Edmund had not tried to teach her, but because necessity and good company are the finest teachers of all. Fletcher Dobbs drove out from Millhaven in late March to check on the credit account and stood at the edge of the north field with his thumbs in his suspenders and looked at what had been accomplished and said, with genuine surprise, "Mrs. Hart, I believe you might just make it." "I told you so," Alma Dobbs said from the wagon seat. "You did," Fletcher agreed. He looked at Walter with a measuring eye. "You do good work, Mr. Hawkins." "The land does the work," Walter said. "We just ask it properly." Alma Dobbs looked between Walter and Cora with the expression of a woman who has been married long enough to know the particular quality of air between two people who are becoming something to each other, and she said nothing about it, which was its own kind of eloquence. April brought a complication. A man named Ruddy Cass, who worked for Norbert Gaines, was found to have filed a secondary claim on the eastern quarter of Cora's land at the county seat in Wichita. A claim that a lawyer in Millhaven named Prescott, who also handled Gaines' legal business, said had precedence because of an error in the original surveying of the Hart claim from 1874. The claim was almost certainly fraudulent, as Walter explained to Cora when he came back from Millhaven having heard the news from the hardware man, but proving it would require a trip to the county seat and the examination of survey records and possibly a legal filing of her own. Cora sat at the table with the information and was quiet for exactly 1 minute and then stood up and got her coat. "I will need to go to Wichita," she said. "Yes," Walter said. "I will drive you." "You do not have to. I know I do not have to," he said. They drove to Wichita in the borrowed wagon, a 2-day journey each way, staying at a boarding house that Cora had found listed in an almanac, a respectable establishment on the main street. The county land office was a tall brick building with a clerk named Birchfield who was initially indifferent to their arrival, but who became considerably more attentive when Cora produced her original homestead documents, properly filed and stamped, and Walter produced a hand-drawn map of the property boundaries based on the actual creek and tree-line markers. And together, they demonstrated that the Ruddy Cass claim was based on a boundary point that did not exist at the location described in the filing. Birchfield spent an hour with the records and emerged with the look of a man who has discovered something unpleasant and would rather not deal with it. "The Cass filing is irregular," he said carefully. "It is fraudulent," Cora said, equally carefully. Birchfield looked at her for a moment, and then said he would refer the matter to the Territorial Land Commissioner, and that the Hart claim would be maintained pending investigation, and that a formal note would be sent to the county with the appropriate administrative hold. They walked out into the April sunshine of Wichita, which was a busy and loud city compared to Millhaven, with wagon traffic and rail noise and the smell of cattle from the stockyards to the south, and Cora stood on the boardwalk with her documents in her bag and felt the satisfaction of a battle correctly fought. "You handled that well," Walter said. "I was angry enough that I was very clear," she said. He smiled at her, the full real smile, and she stopped for a moment with the Wichita street noise all around them and looked at him and made a decision that had probably been made several times before by the part of her that makes decisions without consulting the rest. "Walter," she said. "Yes, I would like to have supper with you tonight. Not for practical reasons, just for the supper." He looked at her with those attentive eyes, and something in them went very warm and steady. "I would like that very much," he said. They found a restaurant on a side street that served beef stew and fresh bread and had actual chairs with backs, which after months of the hard chairs at the cabin felt like an extraordinary luxury. They sat across from each other and ate and talked, and the conversation moved through the easy territory of the day's business and then out into the wider country of each other's minds. And somewhere in the middle of it Cora looked up from her bread and found him looking at her with an expression so open and undefended that it made the breath catch in her throat. "I should like to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I came west the first time because I was running from something," he said. "From the farm, from my father, from the expectation that my life was already decided. I have been moving since I was 20, and I told myself the moving was freedom, but I think I was looking for the place where the moving would stop." He paused. "I think it stopped when I rode onto your property." The restaurant was warm, and there were other diners at other tables, and the sounds of Wichita came through the window, and Cora Hart sat very still for a moment, and then she said, "I think I have been afraid to want things since Edmund died. Not because I was still grieving in the way that prevents wanting, but because wanting something means the possibility of losing it, and I had lost enough." "Yes," he said quietly, "but I find that I am tired of being afraid," she said. "And I find that what I want is rather clear to me." "What do you want?" he asked, and his voice was low and careful. "This," she said, "exactly this. The land and the work and the conversation and the company." She held his gaze. "You." The word fell between them with a weight that was entirely right. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him. And they sat like that in the warm restaurant in Wichita, Kansas, in the spring of 1875. And the world outside the window was large and complicated and full of every kind of difficulty. And inside the restaurant, it was simply the two of them, and the decision they were making without any more words needed. They drove back to Millhaven the next day, and the road was long and rutted, and the April sky was blue and enormous, and they rode side by side on the wagon seat with their shoulders almost touching and talked about the planting and the animals and the summer ahead. And every so often one of them would say something that made the other laugh. And it was ordinary and extraordinary in the way that the best things tend to be both at once. May came in green and warm, and the wheat was up, a thin, even carpet of green across the south field, and Cora stood at the field's edge in the morning light, and felt the particular joy of having put something in the ground and seen it answer. The corn was in, and the kitchen garden along the south wall of the cabin was already showing its first shoots, and the linta was solid, and the fence was tight, and the barn was in better order than it had been when Edmund built it. Walter was rebuilding the chicken coop, which had been part of the original plan, and which Cora had purchased 6 hens for from a woman in Millhaven who was moving to live with a daughter in the East. The sound of his hammer was a steady and familiar sound on those May mornings, punctuating the birdsong along the creek and the soft blowing of hazel in her stall, and Cora had long since stopped trying to be neutral about the pleasure it gave her to hear it. Norbert Gaines rode over one morning in early May. He came alone this time, which was different, and he stopped at the fence line and looked at the green field and the solid fence and the man working on the chicken coop, and then looked at Cora, who stood in the yard with a bucket of water for the garden. "I heard you went to Wichita," he said. "I did," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The Cass claim was a misunderstanding," he said. "The land commissioner appears to agree," she said. Gaines sat his horse and looked at the field again. Whatever calculation he was running behind his eyes, she did not know, but something appeared to resolve in it. "You have done good work here," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something. "Thank you," she said, because the words were true regardless of their source. He looked at Walter briefly and then back at Cora. "I will not bother you again," he said, and turned his horse and rode away. Cora watched him go and then turned back to her garden. Walter had stopped hammering and was looking at her from across the yard. "What did he want?" he called. "To look at what we built," she said. "So I let him look." Walter went back to hammering. Cora went back to her garden. The sun was warm on her back, and the green smell of the May prairie was everywhere, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, not just determined but genuinely happy. On an evening in the last week of May, when the air was soft and the fireflies were beginning to appear along the creek bottom for the first time that year, Walter asked her to walk with him to the south field. She put down her sewing and went, and they walked through the long grass to the edge of the wheat field and stood looking at it in the fading light, the wheat heads just beginning to form, the field breathing with the evening breeze. "I want to ask you something," he said. She was looking at the field. She said nothing but turned her head to listen. "I know we have not spoken in formal terms," he said, "and I know that the practical arrangements of this winter were not conventional, and I know that you are a woman who thinks carefully before she speaks on matters that are important." He paused. He was holding his hat in both hands the way she had noticed he did when he was working through something difficult. "But I find that I cannot continue to not ask." She looked at him now. He was looking at the field. "Cora Hart," he said, and he said her name like it mattered. "I would like to marry you if you will have me. Not because of the homestead, and not because of the spring planting, and not because of the practical arrangements of winter, though I am glad of all of it, but because you are the most remarkable person I have ever stood beside, and I would like to stand beside you for the rest of my life." The fireflies were beginning in the creek bottom. The wheat moved in the soft evening air. The sky to the west was rose and gold along the horizon, and the first stars were appearing in the east. Cora Hart had been told her homestead would fail before spring. She looked at the living field. She looked at the man beside her, this steady, capable, honest man who had ridden into her life when it was in danger of collapsing and brought with him seed and lumber, and a notebook full of careful plans, and a quality of attention she had never known from anyone before, who had worked beside her in the cold and the mud and the blizzard and the Wichita land office and the long seasons of becoming, who held his hat when he was nervous and smiled with his whole face when something was genuinely funny, and carried his sorrows quietly and his joys the same way. "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her, and his expression was everything she had been watching for since December, open and warm and whole. "Yes," he said. "Yes, Walter Hawkins," she said. "I will marry you." He took her hand, and they stood in the south field while the stars came out, and the wheat moved around them, and the fireflies rose from the creek bottom in slow golden pulses. And she thought that Edmund would have liked him, which was not a small thing, and was not a complication, but was simply a truth that she could hold alongside all the other truths without any of them diminishing the others. They were married in June. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, Reverend Tilden, who came through Millhaven on the third Sunday of every month, and who was a compact, cheerful man with enormous side whiskers, and a genuine enthusiasm for the institution of marriage, which he considered among the finer achievements of civilization. Alma and Fletcher Dobbs stood as witnesses. There was a table set up outside the Dobbs store with food that Alma had organized, and half the town attended, which was approximately 30 people, which was all of Millhaven's population, plus 3 families from outlying homesteads who had heard and come in. Cora wore a dress of blue calico that she and Alma had made together through the evenings of May. A good dress, not fancy but right, and she had flowers from the kitchen garden at the cabin pinned at her collar, because they had bloomed that very morning, and she took it as a sign. Walter had borrowed a proper shirt from Fletcher Dobbs and had gotten his hair cut, which changed his face in a way that made her look at him twice in the morning light outside the church, and feel the warmth behind her breastbone that she had stopped fighting somewhere back in January. They said their vows in the dry June air with the cottonwoods in full leaf overhead and the smell of the prairie in summer all around them, and when the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Walter took both her hands and looked at her with those clear eyes and said, quietly enough that only she could hear it, "I will not waste this," and she believed him entirely. The summer was good. Not easy, because nothing on the frontier in 1875 was easy, but good in the way that things built with care and intention tend to be good, solid and purposeful, and capable of bearing weight. The wheat grew and ripened in the long July heat, and they harvested it in August with the help of the Driscoll family from 5 miles south, who came with their sons and their tools and spent 2 days cutting and bundling. And the Harts, as they now were together, fed them and sent them home with a portion of the grain, which was how things were done on the frontier among people who understood that the land required cooperation if it was going to be lived on properly. The harvest was not enormous, but it was real, enough wheat to sell a portion and store a portion. The corn would be ready in September, and there were jars of preserved vegetables from the kitchen garden lining the new shelves Walter had built, and the root cellar he had dug in June against the south wall of the barn was full of potatoes and dried beans. The chickens were laying steadily. They had purchased a second horse, a sturdy bay that Walter found through a trader and bargained down to a price they could manage, and the 2-horse team meant they could break more ground in the fall. It was a different world from the October morning when Cora had stood in the mud with the broken fence post, and she knew it, and she was grateful for it in the way you are grateful for things you have earned. In the evenings of that summer, they would sit on the porch in the cooling air and sometimes talk and sometimes not. And Cora would look at the land going golden in the late light, her land, their land, and feel a kind of contentment that was not complacency, but rather the satisfaction of someone who has arrived somewhere she meant to be. Walter would sit beside her with his long legs stretched out and his hat pushed back, and every so often she would find his hand on her arm or her shoulder or simply beside her own on the porch rail. And she had stopped being surprised by how right it felt and simply let herself have it. Alma Dobbs came out to visit in August and sat with Cora in the kitchen while Walter and Fletcher talked about tools in the barn, and Alma looked around at the stocked shelves and the well-ordered kitchen and the garden visible through the window and said, "You have built something real here, Cora." "We have," Cora said. Alma looked at her with the bright, measuring eye of a woman who pays attention. "You are happy," she said, and she said it as a statement of genuine observation, something she was confirming rather than asking. "I am," Cora said. It was a simple thing to say, and it was entirely true. "Good," Alma said, with the air of someone who had hoped for exactly this outcome and was pleased to have been right. September came with the corn harvest and a new idea that Walter brought to Cora one evening with the same quiet seriousness with which he presented all ideas that mattered to him. He had been in Millhaven and had spoken with the county commissioner who passed through occasionally, and the county was looking at the possibility of funding a small school in Millhaven if a suitable teacher could be found, and if a building could be arranged. The terms were modest but real: a teacher's salary paid quarterly by the county, a building that could be the church on weekday mornings until a proper schoolhouse was built. He told her all of this, and then he looked at her and said, "You said you wanted to teach school." She looked at him for a moment. "That was years ago," she said. "It was last January," he said, "in the blizzard." She was quiet for a moment, turning it over. "The farm needs tending," she said. "The farm can be tended," he said. "We can manage both. The school would be mornings only." She thought about the children she had seen in Millhaven, 6 and 8 and 10 years old, running in the street with the particular energy of young minds that have nothing to do with themselves. No school and no teacher and no books. She thought about how she had felt as a girl with a book in her hands, the sense of a door opening. "I would need to write to the county commissioner," she said. "I took the liberty of getting his address," Walter said, and produced a piece of paper from his shirt pocket with an expression of such studied innocence that she laughed and shook her head. "You planned this," she said. "I thought about it," he said. "I thought about what you said. I pay attention to what you say." She looked at him across the kitchen table, this man who had carried a notebook full of plans for her land from the very first week, who heard everything and forgot nothing, who had driven her to Wichita and stood beside her at the land office and built her a seed box for Christmas and asked her to marry him in a wheat field at dusk. She reached across and took the piece of paper. "Then I will write the letter," she said. She wrote the letter and sent it with the mail rider and received a reply in October that was encouraging. The county commissioner had the position to offer, and would she come to Millhaven on the second Monday of November for an interview with himself and the school board, which consisted of Reverend Tilden and two of the town's more established citizens. The interview went well. Cora was prepared and clear and answered every question with the directness that was simply the way she spoke, and the school board engaged her. And on the first Monday of December of 1875, Cora Hawkins became the first teacher of the Millhaven School, 15 children ranging from age 6 to 14, meeting in the church building Monday through Friday in the mornings. She was extraordinary at it. She had known she would be, not from arrogance but from the kind of self-knowledge that comes from paying honest attention to yourself over time. She knew how to explain things. She knew how to listen to children think. She knew how to make things interesting without making them easy, and the children came back every morning, and that was proof enough. Walter drove her to Millhaven on school mornings and collected her at noon, and in the afternoons they worked the farm together. And it was a good life, busy and purposeful and full of the specific texture of real things, cold mornings and warm evenings and muddy boots and good bread, and the smell of turned earth, and the particular satisfaction of watching children read their first words and watching wheat grow from planted seed. That first winter of their marriage was different from the previous one. The cabin was warmer, the food stores were ample, the animals were secure. The blizzards that came in January were not different from the year before, but the experience of them was entirely different. The two of them sitting by the fire in the evenings with books and conversation, and the comfortable familiar nearness of people who have made a choice and are living inside it. There were hard days. There were days when the wind was merciless, and the work was exhausting, and small things went wrong in the accumulating way of small things. And on those days, Walter would sometimes be quiet in a way that needed respecting, and Cora would sometimes be short-tempered in a way that needed acknowledging. And they navigated these things with the same practical honesty they brought to everything else, speaking plainly and listening well and not leaving things to fester. There was one particular hard day in February when Walter received a letter from Missouri, from a sister, telling him that his father had died. He read the letter at the table and sat very still with it in his hands, and Cora did not ask him anything, but simply moved to sit beside him and put her hand on his arm and waited. After a while he said, "We never made our peace," and she said, "I know," and they sat like that for a long time while the February wind moved across the prairie outside, and she thought about Edmund, who had not had the chance to make peace with anything because the fever did not give him the time, and she thought about the way grief came in layers, not in a single wave but in many over years, and she held her husband's arm and let him have the time he needed. He wrote back to his sister that spring. Cora did not read the letter, but she saw the care with which he wrote it, sitting at the table with the notebook open beside him as though he were planning the crop rows, working through what he wanted to say with the same deliberate attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. In March of 1876, the wheat was in the ground again, and the south field had been expanded to 8 acres, twice what they had planted the first spring, and there was a proper plow now and the 2-horse team and a second hired hand for the harvest seasons. A quiet young man named James, who was new to the territory and needed the work, and who was honest and capable and became something close to a fixture at the Hart homestead during the planting and harvest months. In April of 1876, Cora told Walter that she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning in the kitchen, when the light was coming in the south window and the coffee was on and the school term was in its last weeks before summer. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, and he set down his coffee cup and looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen there before, something enormous and quiet and entirely new, something that looked very much like awe. "Cora," he said, "Yes," she said. "I know." He stood up and came around the table and took her hands in both of his, and he looked at her with those clear eyes that had grown so familiar she sometimes forgot they had once been the eyes of a stranger, and she saw the thing behind them that was not quite joy because it was too full and too still to move at the speed of ordinary joy, something deeper and more permanent. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "Alma says Dr. Kessler in Millhaven is good and I will see him next week." He was still holding her hands. She looked at him and felt the enormity of the moment not as pressure but as fullness, the kind that gathers when everything you have worked for and everything you have loved and everything you have survived arrives at a single point and is recognizably real. "I am going to be a father," he said quietly, not to her precisely, but somewhere between her and the plain fact of it. "You are going to be a father," she said, "and you will be extraordinary at it." He looked at her. "How can you be certain?" "Because I have watched you be patient and careful with every living thing on this farm," she said, "including me. Children require exactly that. You have been in training for it since October." He laughed, and it was the real laugh, the one she had been working to draw out of him since December and which he gave more freely now, and it was one of her favorite things in all the world. The summer of 1876 was a beautiful one. The harvest was the best they had managed yet, the 8 acres of wheat coming in straight and heavy, and the corn was good, and the kitchen garden overflowed with more than they needed, and Cora sent jars of preserved tomatoes and beans and pickles into Millhaven for the general store to sell on commission, which was another small stream of income that built on itself month by month. She taught school through June, and then handed it over to a temporary teacher, a young woman named Miss Pryor who had come from Indiana with proper teaching credentials and who was, in Cora's assessment, capable and kind, and she promised the school board she would return in the fall. She spent the summer months expanding the kitchen garden and working with Walter on the plans for a proper house, not the sod cabin but a proper timber frame house that they would build the following year when they had saved enough, and when Walter could source the lumber at a decent price. He had drawn the plans in his notebook over the winter with the same careful precision he brought to the crop layouts, a house with 2 bedrooms and a proper kitchen, and a south-facing porch and windows that would let in the light from 3 directions. And Cora had added her own thoughts, a study with bookshelves because she intended to have bookshelves, and a proper larder, and he had incorporated every suggestion without argument because he was, as she had told the Dobbs several times with a warmth that made Alma smile, the most reasonable man she had ever met. Their son was born in November of 1876, delivered by Dr. Kessler at the cabin with Alma Dobbs present as support and the November wind outside, and the iron stove going red hot and Walter in the outer room of the cabin, which was the only other room, not quite silent because every so often she heard him moving, pacing perhaps, not able to be still. The baby was healthy and loud and arrived with a great deal of opinion about the world, which Cora took as an encouraging sign. Dr. Kessler pronounced him entirely satisfactory, and Alma cleaned him and wrapped him and brought him to Walter, who came through the door with an expression on his face that she would remember for the rest of her life, the pure undefended wonder of it, the way he took the bundle in his large, careful hands with such extraordinary gentleness. "He looks like you," Walter said, sitting at the edge of the bed and holding the baby and looking at Cora with a face she had never seen on any man. "He has your stubbornness," she said, because the baby was still expressing his opinions loudly. Walter laughed, and the baby, surprised by the sound, went suddenly quiet and appeared to consider the man holding him. "Hello," Walter said to his son very quietly. "I am your father. We are going to figure this out together." They named him Edmund Walter Hawkins. Walter had suggested it, and Cora had felt the tears come before she could prepare for them, not from grief, but from the specific complexity of love, the way it encompasses more than a single person or a single time. Edmund Walter Hawkins, called Ned by his father almost from the first day, was a vigorous and curious baby who grew into a vigorous and curious boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's steadiness. And he was on the farm from the beginning, carried in a cradle on the porch while his parents worked, placed on a blanket in the wheat field during the summer harvest of 1877, which was the first year of the new timber frame house. The house went up in May and June of 1877, a true landmark on the flat prairie, 2 stories of timber frame with a proper shingle roof, and the south-facing porch and the windows that let in the light, and half of Millhaven came out to help raise the walls on the frame, because that was how it was done, and because the Hawkins family had become, over 3 years of consistent presence and honest dealing, the kind of people a community wants to be attached to. The Driscoll family came, and Reverend Tilden, and Fletcher and Alma Dobbs, and the school board members, and a dozen families from outlying claims who had eaten Cora's teaching and Walter's advice about farming and knew both as people of substance. They moved into the house in July, and Cora stood in the kitchen the first evening and ran her hand along the edge of the broad wooden table that Walter had built over the winter, the table that fit the room, that had enough length to feed guests and family, that was solid as the land it stood on. And she thought about the sod cabin and the broken fence post, and the morning Norbert Gaines had told her she would not last the season, and she felt the satisfaction of it all the way through. She returned to teaching in September of 1877, leaving Ned in the care of a young woman from Millhaven who came out to the farm on school mornings, and she taught through the fall and winter with the growing school in the growing building that the county had finally funded, and that went up in October. A proper schoolhouse with 8 windows and a pot-bellied stove, and desks that Fletcher Dobbs had ordered specially from a supplier in Kansas City. Millhaven was growing. The railroad had reached a point 15 miles south by 1877, and the trail from the railhead brought new settlers through on a regular basis, and some of them stayed, and the town added a hardware store and a second boarding house and a doctor's office where Dr. Kessler now kept regular hours. The question of the school had been the one that established Cora as a person of standing in Millhaven in the particular way that building something lasting for a community establishes you, and she was known and respected and sought out for counsel by new settlers, particularly women arriving alone or with uncertain situations, and she gave what she knew freely and directly, and was grateful every time for the ability to do so. Norbert Gaines, whose cattle operation continued on his enormous northern holdings, caused no further trouble to the Hawkins family. The fraudulent land claim filed by Ruddy Cass had been formally rejected by the Territorial Land Commissioner in 1875, and the matter was closed, and Gaines appeared to have concluded, perhaps correctly, that the Hawkins homestead was no longer a soft target. He and Walter passed each other in Millhaven occasionally and exchanged the minimal acknowledgement of men who know each other's position and have decided the knowing is sufficient. The years built on themselves the way years do when the foundation is solid. In 1878, they planted 12 acres of wheat, and the yield was remarkable, a good rain year on the Kansas prairie, and they sold enough grain to pay off the remaining balance of the house and to add a proper barn with a full hay loft and stalls for 4 horses, because Walter had begun dealing in horses, buying sound animals from traders at reasonable prices and selling them on to farmers and ranchers at fair ones, and he had a gift for it. The same quality of attention and patience that he applied to everything he cared about. In 1879, Ned turned 2 and began walking with great determination across the kitchen floor and into the yard, and toward the horse pasture with a directness that required constant supervision and was deeply satisfying to both his parents. He said his first words in October, which were not mama or papa but horse, and the particular emphatic noise he made when he wanted more bread, which Cora felt said something fundamental about his character. In 1880, she found herself expecting again. She told Walter on a Sunday morning in March in the new kitchen in the new house with the coffee and the morning light, and he took her hands the same way he had the first time, and she saw the same wonder on his face, no less for the repetition which she had suspected would be the case with him and which was. "How are you?" he said. "Happy," she said. "Tired, happy." Their daughter arrived in September of 1880, loud and definite and red-faced and entirely herself from the first moment. And they named her Alice Hawkins, after Walter's mother and Cora's younger sister back in Ohio, who she wrote letters to and had not seen in 6 years, but thought of constantly. Was nothing like Ned in temperament, where Ned was steady and observant. Was immediate and vocal, and insisted on being the center of whatever room she occupied from approximately the age of 4 months, and both her parents found this enormously entertaining. Ned adored his sister with the solemn devotion of a serious 3-year-old. He would stand at the edge of her cradle and watch her with the same focused attention his father brought to the crop rows and the horse assessment, as though he were taking inventory of her qualities and finding them satisfactory. The farm in 1881 was a working, productive, expanding operation. 16 acres under cultivation, a full complement of livestock, the school in its 5th year with Cora teaching through the full week now, the horse trade bringing in consistent supplementary income. The sod cabin still stood at the edge of the property, used now as a storage shed, and Cora sometimes paused by it when she was passing and felt the full distance between that first October and this particular morning, not as nostalgia, which is a soft and somewhat dishonest emotion, but as a reckoning, clear-eyed and specific. She had stood in that cabin alone and frightened and determined, and she had built from that place something real and lasting and her own, and she had found, unexpectedly and entirely without looking for it, a partner in that building who was worthy of what he had been given, which was considerable. Walter, in 1881, was 37 years old, and the West had put its marks on him, the way it puts its marks on people who work outside and work hard, lines at the corners of his eyes and a permanent weathering to his skin and hands that bore every kind of history. But he was healthy and strong and in full possession of his best qualities, which had not diminished but deepened with the years. He was known in Millhaven as an honest man and a capable one, and when people had trouble with their land or their animals or their buildings, they came to Walter Hawkins, because he was the kind of man who helped and who did not make you feel small for needing it. He still kept the notebook. He had gone through 5 of them by 1881, the old one stacked on the study shelf beside Cora's books, full of crop plans and field measurements and notes in his small clear hand, and she sometimes took one down and read through it the way you read through a journal, finding in the margins and the pages the record of a mind working steadily toward something good. One evening in the fall of 1881, Cora sat on the south porch after supper while the children were in bed, and Walter was finishing a final check on the animals, which was a habit of his that she had never tried to change because it was simply who he was, a man who checks on the things in his care before he sleeps. The sky over the Kansas prairie was enormous and clear and full of stars, the way prairie skies are clear, without reservation or compromise, and the night smelled of dry grass and cooling air, and the particular clean emptiness of the plains in autumn. Walter came out and sat beside her. He smelled of hay and horses and the cold night air, and he sat with his long legs stretched out in front of him and looked up at the stars. "Ned asked me today what wheat is for," he said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it is for bread and trade and for having the satisfaction of watching a thing you put in the ground come up and become something useful," he said. "He thought about it and said that was a lot for a seed to do." She smiled. "He is right. He is very like you," Walter said. She looked at him sideways. "He is very like you," she said. "The best parts," he said, which was so unlike his usual manner of speaking about himself that she looked at him fully and found him looking back at her with an expression that was simple and clear and entirely serious. "You think you have best parts," she said. "I think I have you," he said. which has always seemed to me the same thing." She looked at him across the porch in the starlight, this man who had arrived with seed and lumber, and a notebook full of plans when she was standing in the mud with a broken fence post and a dying claim, this man who had worked beside her through blizzards and harvests, and a land office in Wichita, and a birth and another birth, and 5 years of mornings and evenings, and all the 10,000 ordinary moments that make up a life together. "Walter Hawkins," she said. "Cora Hawkins," he said. She reached over and took his hand, and he held it the way he held everything he valued, firmly and carefully, and with no intention of letting go. The prairie was dark and enormous and beautiful around them, the Kansas night come down full and starlit and vast, and from inside the house there was the small sound of a child shifting in sleep, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and the wheat field to the south was dark and waiting for winter before it called for spring seed, and there was a lantern burning in the study window making a warm square of yellow light in the dark, and the porch was solid underfoot. Built by hands that had built everything here with intention and care, Cora Hart had been told her homestead would fail before spring. She looked at the land around her, at the barn and the house and the fields and the fences, at the life that had grown up from a single season of determination and one man's willingness to believe in a possibility. And she thought that Norbert Gaines, sitting in his large ranch house to the north, was a man who understood land only as a thing to be held, and that this was precisely why he had never understood her, had never understood that the land was not the point. The land was the ground on which the real thing grew, which was this: a life built with someone who sees what you see and works toward it alongside you, and takes your hand in the dark without being asked. She leaned her head against Walter's shoulder. He rested his cheek against her hair. The stars were everywhere, and the prairie was theirs, and the night was long and full of peace. In the spring of 1882, they planted 17 acres of wheat, and the rains came on time, and Ned Hawkins, 4.5 years old, walked the field rows beside his father with his small hands in the dark soil, learning the weight of a seed and the faith required to put it in the ground. Mee Hawkins, from the edge of the field in Cora's arms, watched her brother and her father in the morning light with the bright, imperious attention she brought to everything, and announced her opinion of the proceedings in her particular way, which was to say loudly and with great conviction. Walter looked up from the field row and caught Cora's eye across the distance, and she shook her head at him with the smile that was only for him, and he went back to the planting. The wheat came up in May. It always did. It always would. The Millhaven School had 23 students by the spring of 1882, and Cora had begun working with the county commissioner about the possibility of a second teacher for the older children, as the range of ages and abilities in a single room was stretching what one person could accomplish, and the commissioner, who had been watching the school's growth with approval, was amenable to the discussion. Cora intended to have the matter settled before fall, because that was the kind of woman she was, the kind who identifies what needs doing and does not wait for someone else to decide the time is right. Walter had taken on a partnership with the Driscoll family on a second property adjoining theirs to the south, a 50-acre piece that had gone unclaimed, and which they intended to break for wheat over the next 3 years. It was an expansion that made logical sense, and that he had planned quietly over the winter and presented to Cora as a proposal in February, with the notebook open to the relevant pages, the field layouts and the cost projections and the 5-year plan, and she had read through it carefully and said yes, and he had said good, and that was how the Hart and Hawkins farm became the Hawkins and Driscoll partnership as well, growing outward in the way of things that are planted properly and given room. They had one more child, a second son, born in the winter of 1883, who they named Thomas, and who arrived with his father's calm disposition and his mother's dark eyes, and who from the beginning regarded the world with a thoughtful patience that made Walter say, more than once, that he was not sure whose child this was because he was clearly the most sensible person in the household. Ned and me, by then 6 and 2, received Thomas with the characteristic responses of their personalities, Ned with solemn and genuine interest, me with the temporary and rapidly resolved suspicion of a child who was accustomed to attention and was not entirely sure about the competition. The winter Thomas was born. Cora sat one evening in the study with the oil lamp, and the bookshelves full of books she had accumulated over the years of teaching. Primers and histories and collections of verse and scientific texts and novels sent from Ohio by her sister, who had married and had children of her own, and with whom she maintained a correspondence that was one of the reliable pleasures of her life. She had a letter open on the desk from her sister Ellen, who wrote that their mother, now elderly and living with Ellen's family, was well and asking after Cora, and who asked, with the cheerful frankness of a younger sister, whether Kansas had been worth it. Cora read the question and looked at the lamp and then at the bookshelves and then through the door into the kitchen where she could see Walter in the low light, sitting at the table with Thomas in the crook of one arm, asleep and small, and the notebook open on the table, and he was writing something one-handed because this was who he was, a man who plans even when his arms are full of what he is planning for. She turned back to the letter and dipped her pen and wrote to Ellen, "Yes, it has been worth it. It has been worth every moment of it, including the moments that nearly broke me, because I would not have what I have now without having first survived those. I am a farmer's wife and a teacher and a mother, and my children are growing up on land that answers when you ask it properly, with a man beside me who is the best person I know. Kansas is cold in winter and hot in summer, and the wind does not stop, and the sky is so large it can be frightening if you let it be, and I would not trade it for anything in the world." She folded the letter and set it aside and went to the kitchen and stood in the doorway, and Walter looked up from the notebook and saw her, and his face did what it always did, the thing she had been watching for since that first evening in December when they sat through the blizzard with the fire going and everything said without words. "Come and sit," he said quietly. "He is finally asleep." She crossed the kitchen and sat beside him at the broad wooden table that he had built for this room, and she looked at Thomas sleeping in his father's arm, this new small person with his whole life ahead of him, and she looked at the notebook open to another year's plans, and she looked at Walter's face in the lamplight, familiar and dear as her own heartbeat. "What are you planning now?" she said. "The South Field," he said. "I want to try a different rotation. Wheat and then fallow and then corn, let the soil rest in between." "You are always thinking about the soil," she said. "The soil is what we have," he said. "You take care of what you have." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "you do." He looked back at her, and the lamp was warm and Thomas slept, and outside the winter wind moved across the Kansas prairie in its ancient cold way, across the flat land and the creek bottom and the wheat fields sleeping under frost, across the new house with its lit window and its south-facing porch, across the life that two people had built from a broken fence post and a cup of bad coffee and a notebook full of careful plans. You take care of what you have. He always had. She always would. And the spring would come, as it always came, and the wheat would answer, as it always did, and the children would grow into the land that waited for them. And the name on the homestead claim that had been filed in 1874 by Edmund Hart had become by 1883 the Hawkins place, known throughout Millhaven and the surrounding county as a good farm and a good family, and the homestead that someone had once told Cora Hart would not last the season. She thought of that sometimes and felt the warmth behind her breastbone that was not quite amusement and not quite satisfaction, but something that contained both and more. She had not lasted. She had flourished. And when people came to her, as they increasingly did, new settlers and struggling homesteaders and women alone on hard claims wondering whether to give up or keep going, she told them what she knew to be true from the bones of her experience, which was this: the land will answer if you ask it properly. Find someone who sees what you see. Do not leave when it is hard. Plant the seed even when you are not sure of the spring. The spring always comes. She had proof of it everywhere she looked.